This tale is something my friend Taro experienced years ago, a night that still sends shivers down his spine. One night, Taro returned home late, exhausted but too restless to sleep. With the lights on and a fast-paced track playing loudly on his recorder, he tried to drown out the silence of the house as he buried himself under his blanket. Suddenly, he heard footsteps ascending the staircase, each step growing louder and stopping right outside his door. Then, his mother's voice pierced through the music, her tone irritated as she asked, "Do you know what time it is? Go to bed early." Annoyed and too tired to respond, Taro ignored her, hoping she would leave. But just a few minutes later, her voice returned, sharper this time, repeating the same reprimand, "Do you know what time it is? Go to bed early." Taro, even more frustrated, decided to pretend she wasn't there, continuing to blast his music in defiance. It was already past 1 a.m. and he found solace in his phone, reading through old messages. One text from earlier in the day caught his eye. "We've arrived in Atomy. Your dad is as excited as a child." It was from his mother, sent while she was on a trip with his father. Taro's heart sank. Cold sweat began to beat on his forehead as the realization hit him, his parents weren't home tonight. Yet, someone or something was outside his door, telling him to go to bed. The footsteps returned, each one echoing louder than the last as they approached his door once more. Frozen with fear, Taro stayed still, barely breathing. The steps stopped, and again, his mother's voice floated through the door, haunting in its familiarity, "Do you know what time it is? Go to bed early." But this time, there were no retreating footsteps. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. Terrified and unable to shake the dread that had settled in his chest, Taro turned up the volume of his recorder, desperately trying to drive away the creeping fear. He hid under his blanket, trembling, every shadow in the room now a potential threat. Minutes, maybe hours passed before he gathered the courage to leave his room. He crept out into the hallway, his heart pounding in his ears. The house was empty, as it should be. No one had returned. But the question lingered in his mind, chilling him to the bone. Who was it that stood outside his door, pretending to be his mother, urging him to sleep? Would you like more stories rephrased in this style, or any specific details added? BNA with ~NOI, vit.hn. ChatGPT A with ~NOI, ChatGPT. Certainly. Here's a more detailed and atmospheric version of the story, expanding on the tension and eerie atmosphere. Who's complaining? This story is a recollection of a terrifying night my friend Taro once experienced, a night that has stayed with him ever since, buried deep in his memory, surfacing only when the shadows grow long, and the silence of the night becomes too much to bear. It was a chilly autumn evening when Taro returned home, the crisp night air biting at his skin. He had been out with friends, but now, as he stepped into the warmth of his house, he felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. The house was unusually quiet, a silence that felt almost oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. Taro flicked on the lights, the sudden brightness doing little to chase away the unease that had settled in his stomach. He was tired, but sleep eluded him. His mind was too restless, his thoughts too scattered. So, in an attempt to drown out the eerie quiet, he turned on his recorder, letting the fast-paced beats of his favorite track fill the room. The music was loud, maybe a little too loud for the late hour, but he didn't care. He just needed to fill the silence. With the lights still on, Taro crawled into bed, pulling the blanket up to his chin as he stared at the ceiling. The familiar rhythm of the music began to lull him into a state of drowsy calm. But just as he felt himself beginning to drift off, he heard footsteps. They were faint at first, a soft creaking of the floorboards as someone or something began to ascend the stairs. Taro's eyes snapped open, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. The footsteps grew louder, each step deliberate and slow, as though whoever was climbing the stairs wanted to be heard. They reached the top, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Taro held his breath, straining to hear, his body tense with anticipation. Then, a voice, muffled but unmistakable, came from just outside his door. "Do you know what time it is? Go to bed early." It was his mother's voice, filled with the familiar tone of gentle reprimand. Taro frowned, annoyance flickering in his chest. He had been too caught up in the music to notice her footsteps earlier, and now he felt a surge of irritation. Why was she nagging him? Couldn't she just let him be? But the more he thought about it, the more something felt off. The voice was his mother's, but it was strange, almost distant, like it was coming from a great distance, or from someone imitating her. Taro shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. He decided to ignore her, pretending not to hear, hoping she would go back to bed. Minutes passed, and Taro was just beginning to relax again when the footsteps returned. They were louder this time, heavier, as if the person was walking with more force. The same voice called out again, sharper, more insistent. "Do you know what time it is? Go to bed early." This time, Taro couldn't ignore the cold shiver that ran down his spine. Something wasn't right. His irritation was quickly replaced by unease, a growing sense of dread that made his skin crawl. But still, he chose to brush it off, turning up the volume on his recorder in an attempt to drown out the voice. He didn't want to think about why it sounded wrong, why it sent a chill down his spine, he just wanted it to go away. But the unease clung to him, refusing to let go. It was past 1 a.m. now, and the house was deathly quiet again, the only sound the muffled beats of his music. Taro, still uneasy, reached for his phone, scrolling through old messages in a bid to distract himself. As he scrolled, one message caught his eye, stopping him cold. "We've arrived in Atomy. Your dad is as excited as a child." The message was from his mother, sent earlier that afternoon. A small smile had crossed his face when he first read it, picturing his father's enthusiasm. But now, as he read the words again, the smile vanished, replaced by a creeping horror. His mother was in Atomy. She had been all day. And she wasn't alone, his father was with her. They were miles away, enjoying a well-deserved vacation, far from home. But if that was true, then who was it that had been speaking to him just moments ago? A cold sweat broke out across Taro's skin as the realization hit him. The voice, the footsteps, they weren't his mother's. They couldn't be. His parents weren't home, and yet, something had been outside his door, something that knew exactly how to mimic his mother's voice. The footsteps returned again, slow and deliberate, each one echoing through the silent house. Taro lay frozen in his bed, his breath shallow, heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The footsteps stopped once more outside his door, and the voice, that same familiar but wrong voice, called out again. "Do you know what time it is? Go to bed early." Taro couldn't move, couldn't speak. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no logic to this. The voice outside his door was persistent, relentless, as though it wouldn't stop until he acknowledged it. But Taro was too terrified to respond, too scared to even breathe too loudly. Instead, he did the only thing he could think of. He turned the volume of the recorder even higher, the music blasting so loud it was almost painful. But the voice was gone, replaced by the pounding beats, and for a moment, Taro allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had imagined the whole thing. Minutes passed in agonizing silence. Taro didn't dare leave his bed, didn't dare look outside his door. But finally, unable to stand the tension any longer, he made a decision. Slowly, cautiously, he peeled back the blanket and stepped out of bed. The floor was cold beneath his feet as he tiptoed to the door, his heart in his throat. He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling, and slowly turned it. The door creaked open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. The house was silent, eerily so, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a move. Taro stepped into the hallway, his breath hitching as he looked around. There was no one there. No shadowy figure, no lingering presence, nothing. The house was empty, just as it had been when he first came home. But the dread remained, heavy and suffocating. He checked every room, his fear mounting with each empty space. The house was exactly as it should be, quiet, still, undisturbed. But the question nagged at him, a cold, gnawing fear in the pit of his stomach. Who had been outside his door, speaking in his mother's voice, telling him to go to bed? Taro never found an answer that night. The footsteps never returned, and the voice never spoke again. But from that night on, the house never felt quite the same. The silence was no longer comforting, but oppressive, filled with the memory of that voice, and the footsteps that had no owner. Even now, years later, Taro still wonders what really happened that night. Was it a ghost, a spirit trying to communicate, or was it something more sinister, something that knew exactly how to prey on his fears? Whatever it was, it left a mark on him, a fear that lingers in the quiet moments, when the house is still, and the night is dark. And sometimes, late at night, when he is alone in the house, Taro swears he can still hear those